for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I am Darren Gibson. The Michigan Republican Party has gone completely cuckoo as they have elected a new leader for the state party. We will talk about her and some of her beliefs. The Securities and Exchange Commission is going after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. A judge tells Fox Propaganda Channel no to dropping a lawsuit filed against it. Plus, we have a Hammer Time segment this week. So before we start with today's topics, a couple of reminders that you can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on Twitter at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on YouTube by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. And you can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. And once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Mastodon, and YouTube accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and KEPJ in San Antonio, Texas. So be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica station. Over the weekend, the Michigan Republican Party held their convention, and they elected a new chair. And I have this story. This is Chaz Danner, the associate editor at New York Magazine's Intelligencer. This is dated February 19th. Many have convincingly argued that the GOP's nominating of candidates who embraced right-wing extremism and disparaged the integrity of election results cost the party dearly in last year's midterm elections. But up in Michigan, where Democrats won every statewide race in November, wiping out Republicans to win control of both legislative chambers and give them a state government trifecta for the first time in decades, the state Republicans seem to have concluded that the best path forward is further rightward. In a contentious convention vote on Saturday, delegates of the Michigan Republican Party elected Kristina Karamo, who is still denying her 14-point election loss in November's Secretary of State race, as their new chairperson. Karamo, who defeated 10 rival candidates in the race, will now run the Republican Party in the swing state for the next 2 years through the 2024 elections, when one of Michigan's U.S. Senate seats will be up for grabs. Here's how the Detroit Free Press reported it in part. Karamo defeated unsuccessful Republican Attorney General candidate Matthew DePerno of Kalamazoo, a fellow election denier who was endorsed in the party chair race by Donald Trump. Karamo had 58% of the vote on the final ballot. DePerno had 42%. By the way, this went 3 votes. In a brief victory speech as convention delegates were hustled out of the Lansing Center, Karamo said, quote, "We will not betray you. We will not lie to you." End of quote. The cash-strapped state party had only paid to rent the hall until late afternoon. Officials extended the arrangement until 8 p.m., but told delegates they had to leave quickly after the third ballot. So there you go. That's the Michigan Republican Party for you. They're losing money. They can't fundraise. And now they're in debt up to their eyeballs. This is beautiful. And it's going to get worse because now they've got Kristina Karamo running the ship. DePerno also had the support of MAGA personality and MyPillow Mike Lindell indicating that Donald Trump and his allies were ultimately unable to exert influence over Michigan's rising right-wing grassroots, who have been mounting an aggressive insurrection against moderate Republicans in the state. It seems highly unlikely that this shift is going to help the Michigan GOP remain relevant beyond the fringe, let alone sufficiently funded moving into the 2024 election cycle. Karamo, a devout conservative Christian and former community college instructor, God, that's scary, who makes history as the first black chair of the Michigan Republican Party, holds extreme views on a number of subjects and has promoted Christian nationalism and various right-wing conspiracy theories in recent years. She's also as loud and proud an election denier as they come. Karamo quickly rose through the ranks of Michigan right-wing politics after claiming she personally witnessed voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election. In a speech Saturday, she championed her refusal to concede her loss to Democratic incumbent Jocelyn Benson in last year's Secretary of State race, insisting that, quote, conceding to a fraudulent person is agreeing with the fraud, which I will not do, end of quote. No, that's called being delusional. In addition to her stolen election claims, she said Antifa was behind the Capitol riot, has promoted the Clinton kill list conspiracy theory and various alleged plots involving George Soros, and often cites demonic influence as the reason for the country's ills. Oh, brother. Last year, the liberal watchdog Media Matters highlighted comments Karamo made in 2020 as a podcast host, detailing how Beyonce, Ariana Grande, Cardi B, and Billie Eilish were promoting paganism and acting as tools of Satan. She also acknowledged Jay-Z was a Satanist, though she acknowledged she lacked hard proof for that claim, said yoga was a satanic ritual, and called out a Korean dramedy for a plotline in which a character was communicating with demons. Some of those comments were framed around the importance of protecting children from satanic influence. Vice News has reported that during a 2020 appearance on a QAnon podcast, Karamo called abortion satanic child sacrifice and promoted the conspiracy theory that abortion providers harvest and sell organs, which is total bullshit. Though Karamo has denied that she supports QAnon, in 2021 she spoke at a Las Vegas conference linked to the movement. Vice also highlighted Karamo's anti-LGBTQ views and how she once referred to gender-affirming care for trans youth as straight demonic, as well as how she admitted that she wished harm and or misfortune on secular progressives. Not as much as the harm and the misfortune that I wish upon you, lady. CNN's K-File has noted that Karamo once suggested that demonic possession could be transmitted through intimate relationships. So you could have sex and, I guess, impregnate somebody with the devil, according to her. Wow. I shouldn't laugh, but this is ridiculous. She also claimed on her own podcast that women who marched in the 2017 Women's March were addicted to porn, citing a small apparent drop in U.S. Pornhub viewership among women on the day of the march. Karamo said the marching women supported abortion, quote, so they can live sexually promiscuous lives, end of quote, and thus, quote, didn't have time to watch their porn, end of quote, while at the rallies. But good God, this is just unbelievable stuff here. 2 days before being elected Michigan Republican chair, Karamo re-emphasized her demon-hunting bona fides during a speech to a right-wing patriot group, according to a report published by the Washington Post. Karamo said, quote, when we start talking about the spiritual reality of the demonic forces, it's like, oh my God, this is crazy. We can't go there. No, it's like, did you read the Bible? Didn't Jesus perform exorcisms? Scriptures are clear, and so if we're not operating as though the spirit realities of the world exist, we're going to fail every time. End of quote. After Saturday's convention and vote, which a large number of moderate Republicans skipped, Conservative Detroit News columnist Nolan Finley wrote that it was the de facto end of the Michigan Republican Party, warning that, quote, a party that has already become unacceptable to moderate voters will become unappealing even to conservatives, end of quote. Well, good. I gotta applaud that. Because Nolan Finley, by the way, has been a past recipient of Douchebag of the Week on this show for his conservative views. So for him to call the time of death of the Republican Party in the state of Michigan is astounding. Absolutely astounding. Well, I hope it comes true. But since we're talking about Karamo, I want to get to this story. This was published back in September of 2022 by the website Deadline Detroit. This is a report by Alan Lengel. Kristina Karamo, Michigan's Republican nominee for Secretary of State at the time, again, this was September 2022, allegedly tried to crash a car with her husband and 2 children in it when he asked for a divorce. That's according to his claim in Oakland County Family Court. Those court documents were discovered by Jezebel.com. Karamo denies the allegations, talking about Kristina Karamo. The news website writes that Karamo's ex-husband, Adam Karamo, claimed that the Trump-backed candidate threatened multiple times to kill herself or their daughters, who are now 13 and 14. The allegations were in 2021 motions seeking additional parenting time with the daughters after the marriage ended. Adam also alleged in one incident that he was driving the whole family and Karamo, quote, attempted to wrestle control of the vehicle, end of quote, from him and crash it. He claimed that she said in the moment, quote, "F it, I'll kill us all," end of quote. He also alleged that she was committed to a healthcare facility for a mental health evaluation. Again, that's according to the report published by Jezebel. Adam, who lives in Florida, says in a court filing that the car incident happened several years ago, and he didn't believe that Karamo was in that shaky state of mind any longer, again, according to Jezebel. No, she just now believes that you could have sex and transfer a demon between partners. Unreal. Karamo, her campaign, and the Michigan Republican Party did not respond to multiple requests for comment from Jezebel. Her attorney told the New York-based publication, quote, "I will not discuss anything with you," end of quote. But WJBK television reports that she denies the allegations, saying her husband made the false statements to exploit her. She told WJBK in a statement, quote, "Media entities and my opponents are desperate, so they want to push false allegations with zero evidence. They are terrified of this movement uniting Michiganders of diverse beliefs and backgrounds that will save this state. I love my children, I have forgiven my ex-husband, and I look forward to serving the citizens of Michigan," end of quote. In a court filing, Karamo's attorney last October denied the candidate threatened to kill herself or their daughters. It noted that since the divorce, Adam has left the daughters in his wife's care without objection, and his judgment would have been questioned had he thought their safety was at risk. So there you go, folks. That's what you got. Cuckoo. Speaking of more cuckoo stuff here, I want to get to this story. I wanted to cover this on last week's show, but we ran out of time. This is Jennifer Peltz writing for the Associated Press out of New York City. Fox Propaganda Channel lost an attempt last week Tuesday to shut down a multi-billion-dollar defamation lawsuit that accuses the network of spreading lies that a voting technology company helped steal the 2020 election from Donald Trump. New York Supreme Court Appellate Division, a mid-level appeals court, ruled against the network, which wanted judges to dismiss the $2.7 billion defamation case. The company that brought the case, Smartmatic, has said it played a valid and small role in the election. It hailed the ruling as a step toward holding Fox accountable for amplifying unsupported and damaging claims from Trump's lawyers. Fox Propaganda Channel cast the case as an attempt to chill journalism, expressing confidence the network ultimately would prevail. What journalism? This is Fox Propaganda Channel. There's no journalism there. Tuesday's decision means Smartmatic's suit continues against Fox hosts Maria Bartiromo and Janine Pirro, former host Lou Dobbs, and Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani. A claim against Trump lawyer Sidney Powell was dismissed earlier because she doesn't have ties to New York, where the case was filed. The 5-judge ruling concluded there were significant allegations that Giuliani and Powell defamed the company. The 5 judges wrote in a unanimous opinion, quote, "The complaint alleges in detailed fashion that in their coverage and commentary, Fox, Dobbs, and Bartiromo effectively endorsed and participated in the statements with reckless disregard for or serious doubts about," end of quote, whether there was any reliable evidence for them. Citing the same reasoning, they also reinstated Smartmatic's claims against Pirro, which a lower court had thrown out. Federal and state election officials, exhaustive reviews in battleground states, and Trump's own attorney general found no widespread fraud that could have changed the outcome of the 2020 election, nor did they uncover any credible evidence that the vote was tainted. Trump's allegations of fraud also were roundly rejected by dozens of courts, including by judges whom he had appointed. The ruling comes as Fox propaganda channel fights a separate $1.6 billion defamation lawsuit from Denver-based Dominion Voting Systems, with a trial date in April. The network also is fighting a lawsuit from a Venezuelan businessman who said he was wrongly accused of trying to corrupt the election. Florida-based Smartmatic said that in the 2020 presidential election, its technology and software were used only in California's Los Angeles County. The Democratic bastion went, as expected, for Democratic nominee, now President Joe Biden. But Smartmatic says Fox propaganda and the 3 hosts repeatedly allowed Trump's lawyers to falsely portray Smartmatic as a foreign company involved in a sprawling multi-state operation to flip votes to Biden from the Republican incumbent. During a series of post-election day appearances, Giuliani asserted that the company had been, quote, "formed in order to fix elections," end of quote. Powell called it a huge criminal conspiracy, and the two claimed that proof would be forthcoming. After Smartmatic's lawyers demanded a retraction, Fox propaganda channel aired an interview with an election technology expert who said there was no evidence that the company's technology had monkeyed with the election results. He refuted various claims that Giuliani and Powell made. Smartmatic lawyer J. Eric Connolly said in a statement Tuesday, quote, "Fox, its news anchors and guests knowingly and falsely published lies," end of quote. The company maintains that the network can't claim free speech protections for its conduct. That's right, because it's libel. Well, libel is printed, slander is spoken, so I guess they would get both, because once they publish it on their website, that becomes a libel case. Because it's spoken on the air, that's a slander case. And the only defense for libel and slander is the truth. And since they don't have the truth, they can't prove the truth, they're liable. In the meantime, Fox argues that it can, saying it was informing the public about newsworthy, if controversial, claims from an important figure about a matter of public concern. The network said, quote, "There is nothing more newsworthy than covering the President of the United States and his lawyers making allegations of voter fraud," end of quote. The network added that they were confident that they would be vindicated. Fox called the damage claims outrageous and, quote, "nothing more than a flagrant attempt to deter our journalists from doing their jobs," end of quote. What jobs? Spreading bullshit? That's their job. A message seeking comment on Tuesday's ruling was sent to Giuliani's lawyers. They have said that Giuliani's statements were protected by the First Amendment and other laws and principles. Oh, really? Once again, libel and slander has only one defense: the truth. Libel and slander is not protected speech. It isn't. Giuliani is a lawyer, allegedly. He ought to know this by now. All right, so I want to get to our next story here. This is a press release. I'm going to read from it here. Issued by the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is dated February 21st out of Washington, D.C. Folks, listen to this. The Securities and Exchange Commission today announced charges against Ensign Peak Advisors Incorporated, a nonprofit entity operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to manage the church's investments, for failing to file forms that would have disclosed the church's equity investments and for instead filing forms for shell companies that obscured the church's portfolio and misstated Ensign Peak's control over the church's investment decisions. The SEC also announced charges against the church for causing these violations. To settle the charges, Ensign Peak agreed to pay a $4 million penalty, and the church agreed to pay a $1 million penalty. The SEC's order finds that from 1997 through 2019, Ensign Peak failed to file Forms 13F, the forms on which investment managers are required to disclose the value of certain securities they manage. According to the order, the church was concerned that disclosure of its portfolio, which by 2018 grew to approximately $32 billion, would lead to negative consequences. Yeah, it would lead to less people donating to the church. To obscure the amount of the church's portfolio and with the church's knowledge and approval, Ensign Peak created 13 shell LLCs, ostensibly with locations throughout the U.S., and filed Forms 13F in the names of these LLCs rather than in Ensign Peak's name. The order finds that Ensign Peak maintained investment discretion over all relevant securities, that it controlled the shell companies, and that it directed nominee business managers, most of whom were employed by the church, to sign the commission filings. The shell LLC's Forms 13F misstated, among other things, that the LLCs had sole investment and voting discretion over the securities. In reality, the SEC's order finds Ensign Peak retained control over all investment and voting decisions. Gurbir S. Grewal, director of the SEC's Division of Enforcement, said, quote, "We allege that the LDS Church's investment manager, with the church's knowledge, went to great lengths to avoid disclosing the church's investments, depriving the commission and the investing public of accurate market information. The requirement to file timely and accurate information on Forms 13F applies to all institutional investment managers, including nonprofit and charitable organizations." End of quote. Ensign Peak agreed to settle the SEC's allegation that it violated Section 13F of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and Rule 13F-1 thereunder by failing to file Forms 13F and for misstating information in these forms. The church agreed to settle the SEC's allegation that it caused Ensign Peak's violations through its knowledge and approval of Ensign Peak's use of the shell LLCs. Paul Feint conducted the SEC's investigation under the supervision of Tracy Combs and Tanya Beard of the Salt Lake Regional Office and Laura Metcalf of the Denver Regional Office. So there you go, folks. The long arm of the law has finally nabbed the Mormons. You can't get away with this. You're going to get found out. You really are. I tell you what, I've said it before on the show, and I'll say it again. It is time, it is high time to start taxing the churches heavily. This is why $32 billion in investments that they tried to hide. And the thing is, this story isn't being reported on in the national media. We're the only ones that are reporting on this, to my knowledge. This should infuriate everybody. You really should be pissed off about this, big time. Something else you should be upset about is this story published by Inside Radio. They're a trade publication for the radio and television industry. This story is dated February 16th. We mentioned this on the show a couple of weeks ago, but this is a little bit of an update to it. The Federal Trade Commission's proposal to prohibit nearly every use of non-compete agreements has already received pushback from business groups like the Chamber of Commerce. Now the agency is being accused of engaging in a power grab by a group of Republican lawmakers. They say the FTC is poised to impose a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach that violates basic American free market principles. Oh, here we go again. The free market. When you hear Republicans talking about free market, that means they want rich people to get richer and poor people to become poorer. Just going to tell it like it is. In a letter to FTC Chair Lena Khan and the other commissioners of the FTC, House Judiciary Committee Chair Jim Jordan, Republican of Ohio, wrote this, quote, "This power grab is just the latest example of the Biden FTC straying from the commission's mandate in its eagerness to centrally plan the American economy to meet a preferred social agenda." End of quote. Hey, Jim, don't you have a sexual scandal to cover up somewhere? Asshole. Jordan and 3 other lawmakers who signed the letter say they are conducting oversight on the FTC's power grab. The letter was also signed by Representatives Darrell Issa, Republican of California, Thomas Massie, Republican of Kentucky, and Scott Fitzgerald, Republican of Wisconsin. Yeah, 4 nut jobs, 4 puppets to the rich, because that's what they are. They're doing the work of the rich, because this proposal would hurt rich people, because they'd have to pay more to keep people employed. The FTC last month proposed a new rule that would ban employers from imposing non-competes on their workers, a widespread and often used practice among broadcasters, especially with on-air personalities and salespeople. The FTC would bar employers from requiring workers to sign new non-compete agreements, and it would require they rescind existing non-competes within 6 months of the new rule's adoption. Employers would also need to give notice to the worker that the non-compete clause is no longer in effect and will not be enforced. By stopping the practice, the Federal Trade Commission estimates that it could not only put more money into workers' pockets, but also expand career opportunities for about 30 million Americans. Unlike some state-level non-compete bans, the federal prohibition would include almost no exceptions. The draft rule would only allow non-competes when someone is selling a business. That means that when a radio station is sold, buyers would still be allowed to negotiate restrictions on the business activities of the station's former owner. Hey, that's a good rule to have right there. The proposed rule would also generally not apply to other types of employment restrictions like non-disclosure agreements. However, other types of employment restrictions could be subject to the rule if they are so broad in scope that they function as non-competes. The lawmakers take issue with the fact that the FTC's proposed rule makes a broad preliminary finding that non-compete clauses are inherently exploitative and coercive for most employees, and they say it would have significant adverse effects on the U.S. economy. Bullshit! What they want to do is they want to keep workers poor and the owners rich. The 4 Republican assholes write in their letter, quote, "The Biden FTC's proposed rule on non-compete clauses shows the radicalness of the so-called hipster antitrust movement that values progressive outcomes over long-held legal and economic principles." End of quote. Just because something has been long-held legal and has been a principle for a long time, that doesn't mean that you should keep it. Republicans never want change. Never. For that matter, most Democrats never want change. They want the status quo. Why? Because the status quo keeps rich people rich and the poor people poor. You won't hear it anywhere else except on this show. The group also believes that the FTC's proposed rule exceeds the authority that Congress has given the agency. Their letter says, quote, "The FTC has no authority in federal statute to initiate this type of rulemaking," end of quote. Adding the proposal is, quote, "a chilling example of the Biden FTC's radical belief that it has the power to regulate wide swaths of the economy," end of quote. While some in Congress are hoping to stop the FTC dead in its tracks, others are proposing something similar. A group of bipartisan lawmakers last week reintroduced the Workforce Mobility Act, which would narrow the use of non-compete agreements in much the same way that the FTC would. House sponsor Representative Mike Gallagher, Republican of Wisconsin, said, quote, while the FTC has proposed reforming these agreements, Congress must go further and permanently modify these burdensome regulations, end of quote. This is a Republican saying this. And by the way, I don't believe that's Mike Gallagher, the radio host, so different Mike Gallagher. Employment attorneys think the odds are good that the FTC will take some action, with the unknown being how likely court challenges play out. During a webinar last week, Manat partner David Reichenberg predicted there will be a series of lawsuits from business groups that challenge the FTC's authority. It's a potentially years-long process that could lead to the Supreme Court. The biggest short-term impact will hinge on whether a judge puts enforcement of the rule on hold while the appeals process advances. Reichenberg said, quote, I think there's a good chance that the rules are going to be enacted, but as far as how it's enforced and what courts will do with it is the real question, end of quote. Yeah, it's beyond time. It is high beyond time to get rid of these non-compete clauses. They restrict free trade. Aren't Republicans in favor of free trade? No, you're restricting it by having these non-competes. But they don't see it that way. They see it, as I've said, that these non-competes allow the rich to exploit the poor. It's a continuation of the status quo. It really is, folks. All right. We have been talking on this show for quite a while about what's been happening in Ottawa County, Michigan with the Ottawa Impact, the far-right nut jobs there that are now running the county. This story has now hit the national news services, and I want to get to this. This is David Siders writing for Politico.com. This is dated February 21st out of West Olive, Michigan. The agenda for the Ottawa County Governing Board's most recent meeting here last week listed, among other issues, a roof repair and resurfacing contract, a budget calendar that needed setting, and from IT, a request to hire one more employee. They were terrestrial concerns. But over the course of a meeting that ran more than 4 hours, public speaker after speaker, in 3-minute increments, were debating something else entirely, something far more spiritual. To what extent their government should or should not pursue Judeo-Christian values. As snow dusted the streets outside the county building in this conservative, deeply religious swath of western Michigan, lots of people spoke in favor. They warned of the tyranny of mask mandates, the sexualization of our children, and the unhinged, caterwauling fascists of the left. One woman thanked the commissioners, quote, for trying to bring our freedom back, end of quote, while a man read to them from Isaiah, be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Yeah, here's what I think. Yeah, there you go. It's been going like this in Ottawa County since last month after an upstart band of far-right Republicans unseated 7 more traditionalist Republican incumbents, seizing a majority on the 11-member board. The hardliners, members of a group called Ottawa Impact, had signed a contract with Ottawa promising to, quote, respect the values and faith of the people of Ottawa County, end of quote, and to, quote, secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and future generations, end of quote. They pledged to, quote, recognize our nation's Judeo-Christian heritage and celebrate America as an exceptional nation blessed by God, end of quote. Somebody hasn't read their history. Separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson. At candidate forums inside a Baptist church not far from the county offices here, they talked about their faith. Roger Bergman, the sole incumbent Republican commissioner the group failed to oust, had attended one of those forums last year, and as he sat in the audience, he grew concerned. But even Bergman, who at 76 has decades in local politics, wasn't sure what it would all mean when it came time for a new far-right majority to actually govern. That is, until they took office last month and havoc broke out. In their first meeting, The new board members adopted a series of measures that changed things in Ottawa County. They fired the county administrator and replaced him with John Gibbs, a former Trump administration official, Christian missionary, failed congressional candidate, and election denier who once suggested women should not have the right to vote. They ran out their corporate counsel. They closed the county's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. They picked for their new public health officer, pending state approval, a safety manager and an HVAC service company who, during the COVID pandemic, suggested ivermectin and neti pots instead of social distancing and masks. And they rewrote the county motto. No longer was Ottawa County where you belong, but rather where freedom rings. No, it should say Ottawa County, we're full of bullshit. After a commission meeting where a young man in a hoodie named Caden Hembrow thanked the board majority for standing against forces of darkness, Bergman told the reporter David Siders, quote, "Oh my God, it's becoming more and more evident that these people are Christian nationalists," end of quote. Nationally, the most Trumpian right wing of the Republican Party had been a disaster for the Republicans in November, with hardliners losing in competitive states like Pennsylvania and Arizona and underperforming in House races elsewhere. Those candidates' inability to attract moderate Republicans and independents was a big reason the midterms defied expectations, resulting in a less than red wave year. In Michigan, a swing state, it was the same story. Democrats not only held on to the governorship, but flipped the state legislature, gaining full control of state government for the first time in 40 years. But if the Republicans paid a price elsewhere for its rightward drift, it didn't here in a county that Donald Trump carried by more than 20 percentage points in 2020. In this predominantly white county of about 300,000 people, the entire election last year was functionally over after the primary. What remained was an object lesson in what happens when the far right runs the enterprise. It's still government, but its meetings can look a lot more like a cross between a MAGA rally warm-up act and a Christian revival. Somebody posted a video that I saw. They had a great idea in Germany. There were a bunch of Nazis marching in Germany holding Russian flags. By the way, it's been confirmed because somebody was trying to say, oh, that wasn't what they were marching for. No, it's because they can't carry Nazi flags. You own a Nazi flag in Germany, you're going to prison for years. You deny the Holocaust in Germany, you are going to prison for years. On the day that political reporter David Siders visited, Ken Schwalier, an apple grower, went to the microphone to thank the new board for reversing what he called, quote, a long trend in our country falling away from our constitutional past, end of quote. He also told the commissioners, quote, we're part of something new. It's a grassroots effort that I'm glad to see here. We don't see it very many places, but I hope it starts here and grows across the country. End of quote. Yeah, because these people are Christo-fascists. I'll say it a little bit later in this article too, so let me continue. Bergman sat through the meeting, his gaze fixed on the lectern and his left hand on his chin. He considers himself plenty Christian. A former mayor of Grand Haven, the county seat located on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, he helped start a church himself. On his biography on the county website, he counted his own blessings from God. This, he said, was different. Earlier this month, the Public Religion Research Institute and Brookings Institution had estimated, based on a recent survey, that more than half of Republicans nationally either sympathized with or adhered to views of Christian nationalism, a worldview shaped by the fusion of Christian messaging and American identity. It wasn't exactly hiding in the corners of American public life. When the words came to Bergman the next day, he texted them to the reporter for this piece, saying, quote, the phrase I was looking for yesterday was, they have chosen to weaponize Christianity, end of quote. This is a Republican saying this. This is amazing. For anyone who's endured a county government meeting or flipped past one on public access TV, it may not strike you as the likeliest place for a spiritual crusade. It wasn't in Ottawa County either before COVID. Doug Jepkes, a former news person who once owned a local radio station and plays the organ every Sunday at his church, said that for years he tried to hook his listeners on county government. Quote, no matter what I said or did or editorialized, I couldn't get much interest. End of quote. But public health mandates related to the pandemic infuriated a group of parents who complained and unsuccessfully litigated about government overreach in schools. They formed Ottawa Impact, recruiting a slate of candidates to run against the commission's Republican incumbents. And they broadened their concerns from public health to a wholesale overhaul of how the county was being run. At one forum last year at the Lighthouse Baptist Church in Holland, Sylvia Rodea, a co-founder of Ottawa Impact and now vice chair of the county commission, described the election as one that, quote, will decide whether we are going to save America, and that starts local, end of quote. She said that America is a place of opportunity, quote, built on the Constitution, Christianity, and capitalism, end of quote. Wow. She added that the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion was promoting what she called, quote, woke ideology, end of quote. Joe Moss, the group's other co-founder and now chair of the commission, said, quote, there is a mighty force at our back, and everything that we do, we are doing for the glory of God, end of quote. John DeBlay, a member of the local Republican Party's executive board, said that's not Christian nationalism. He said it's just everyday family people who, quote, value our faith, our family, and our freedom, end of quote. No, I got news for you. That's Christo-fascism, buddy. He added, quote, for the first time in my life, I can honestly tell you it is like a good versus evil fight that's going on in the world right now, end of quote. Let me tell you which ones of you are evil. It's you Christo-fascist bastards, like the assholes on the Ottawa County Commission. These right-wing nut jobs, they're nuttier than an entire goddamn fruitcake factory. The fallout has seemingly come from everywhere. In an email to the board, the county's outgoing attorney warned that firings of multiple senior county officials would jeopardize the county's bond rating, saying, quote, stable counties don't fire their corporation counsel and administrator, end of quote. The county's top health official, Adeline Hambley, is suing members of the board. Yeah, because they illegally fired her. She cannot be removed under state law unless she did something wrong. They can't just replace her willy-nilly. That is state law. And in a letter to the county last week, Democratic State Attorney General Dana Nessel said she had reviewed dozens of complaints about the board's behavior at its first meeting in January, in part related to whether board members had made personnel decisions before being seated and behind closed doors. Though the state had not determined the board violated open meetings laws, she said, quote, the alleged conduct of certain commissioners is the antithesis of transparency and good governance, end of quote. In the Holland Sentinel newspaper, it's been headline after headline, like, Christian nationalism is gripping the nation. Has it arrived in Ottawa County? Or, Ottawa County's prospective health officer has no experience. Here's why that could be a problem. And then there are the hours-long public comment sessions at the board's regular meetings. There are supporters and there are critics, people who call the board members fascist or troglodytic. One man said to them last week, quote, right now I'm looking at the face of a theocracy, end of quote. Karen Obitz, a Democrat who said she has supported traditionalist Republicans in the past, said she was struggling as a Christian to understand an approach to government that she said smacked of Christo-fascism. Field Reichhardt, a longtime observer of politics in the county, said this, quote, this is a microcosm of what is happening nationally, the changes that are threatening American democracy, end of quote. Reichhardt is a Grand Haven business person who worked on the presidential campaigns of George Romney, Nelson Rockefeller, Pete McCloskey, George H.W. Bush, and Gerald Ford, who was a family friend. He added, quote, "This Christian nationalist movement truly frightens me," end of quote. Reichart, who ran unsuccessfully for Congress as a centrist Republican in 2010 before leaving the party and becoming an independent last year, said, quote, "They think they are doing God's work, and they truly believe it. They are beyond right-wing. They are proud Boisean. Clearly, that's what they are when they refer to diversity, equity, and inclusion as being divisive," end of quote. Getting back to Japke's, he was thinking about how big this story was, and earlier had drawn a comparison to a lengthy strike at an industrial plant in Grand Haven in the 1960s. He said that what's happening in Ottawa County is deeper. Quote, "There's a spiritual dimension here that's really concerning to me, because every time I hear all this stuff, I think my Lord's taking a kick in the teeth again. This isn't Christianity. I don't know what this stuff is, but it isn't the Christianity I know," end of quote. He added, quote, "I think it's deeper than just political," end of quote. The ascendance of the far right in Ottawa County is not an isolated case. It happened in Shasta County, California, a red enclave in an otherwise blue state. Conservatives across the country have been making runs at school boards. The problem for hardliners is that in general elections in more moderate districts and states, their brand of republicanism has difficulty traveling. Steve Redmond, the president of the Ottawa County Patriots, which started as part of the Tea Party movement, organized forums at the church where Ottawa Impact candidates spoke last year. His group's banner hung from the lectern. Redmond, who's 75 and has been involved in Republican politics for decades, said that the Ottawa Impact movement was a, quote, "natural response," end of quote, to COVID restrictions. He called it a parental rights movement, not Christian nationalism. He said of the Ottawa Impact board members, quote, "Most of them are conservative. They vote Republican. Many of them supported Donald Trump. Most of them are practicing Christians, and their faith is very important to them. Yes, in their meetings, they bring up scripture and other things. That's kind of who they are. But I don't think they're trying to create a totalitarian Christian county. I think they're simply trying to create good governance," end of quote. Bullshit. They want a theocracy. They want a Christo-fascist theocracy. Ottawa County board member Jacob Bonema, who was endorsed by Ottawa Impact, said, quote, "I believe that this new board wants to promote family values and freedom for everyone in Ottawa County. It is being mistaken and misreported to be only for some rather than for everyone, and I resent that accusation," end of quote. No, we're just telling the truth. Right here on this show, the Holland Sentinel is telling the truth. You just don't like to hear the truth, Jacob. Bonema added that he believed that conservative government is exportable. He added, quote, "It needs to be done correctly," end of quote. He worried that proper processes weren't followed at the board's first meeting, which he missed. It's an opinion that has put him at odds with some of Ottawa Impact's most fervent supporters. Redmond had more of a political concern. He said that for the conservative movement, Ottawa Impact's takeover of the county board, quote, "could end up being counterproductive if they don't find a way to govern well, dot the I's, cross the T's, follow the protocols, and resolve some of the current critiques," end of quote. He called it all very resolvable, but there is a risk, he said, if the board cannot cool things down. He said, quote, "They risk having so much of a pushback that some of them would get primaried in 2 years. And even worse, if they didn't get primaried, it will set the stage for the Democrats to come in and take over, and that would be a real disaster," end of quote. No, it wouldn't. It would be refreshing to see Democrats running Ottawa County for once. But don't expect that to happen. Ottawa County is so heavily Republican that's probably a long way off. But the county is one of the state's fastest growing, and change isn't inconceivable. Former Republican Michigan State House Speaker Paul Hilligans of Holland said, quote, "When you look at the statewide election results, it's clear there are a lot of disaffected Republicans and more Republicans voting independently. And I think we'll see more of that in Ottawa County, I'm guessing, if the party continues to move in the direction it's going," end of quote. Then they mentioned Kristina Karamo being elected the new party chair. So that just continues the downward slide of the party on the statewide level. In Ottawa County, Republicans supportive of Ottawa Impact are already privately discussing primarying members of the group backed last year, but who have since questioned some of their actions, including Jacob Bonema. This came up during the board meeting last week after Walter Davis, a retired college professor who had promised to speak at every commission meeting for 2 years as a form of protest, told the board he had to break that promise on the advice of his doctor. He couldn't afford to let his blood pressure up. He said, quote, "It turns out being around you is injurious to my health," end of quote. During a break in the meeting, Bonema approached Davis and put his hand on his arm and told him, quote, "I'm sorry we won't be hearing from you. I find you interesting even if we disagree," end of quote. It was an unusual, if basic moment of congeniality in an otherwise disagreeable room. A resident supportive of the new board was not offended by Bonema's gesture of goodwill, but he wondered how long Bonema would be around anyway. As Bonema walked back into the boardroom, the man that witnessed the exchange said, quote, "He'll be primaried," end of quote. The far right had taken over the board once. There was a good chance it could reshape it if its elected officials fell out of line. And that's what they're already going for at this rate. This is scary stuff, folks. This needs to end now before it gets out of control. And right now, let's go ahead to our next segment.
Stop. Hammer time.
Oh, yeah, it's hammer time. It is time to drop the hammer on the douchebag of the week. This week's winner is far-right political activist Laura Loomer. Why does she win this week? For this post that she made on Twitter on February 18th. Quote, "Breaking. Former President Jimmy Carter has entered hospice care. He's lived a long life. He's lucky. He got to live long enough to see a Democrat in the White House who was more destructive than he was. He should feel blessed." End of quote. Laura Loomer is a I'm just going to very bluntly say it. To Laura Loomer, congratulations. We have this message for you.
Don't be a douchebag.
Yeah, you got that right. Hey, Laura, why don't you stop being a douchebag for once in your life? Oh, you can't help it. F*** you. And yes, we definitely want to mention the news that came out over the weekend that former President Jimmy Carter has announced that he is entering hospice care after a series of short hospital stays. So it's very sad to hear that Jimmy Carter's in his final days. One final story that I want to get to has to do with the Michigan State University shooting. The Detroit Free Press editorial board published an editorial on February 19th, and I'm going to read it here. "Amid despair, we search for hope. We try to believe that this time things will be different. 3 Michigan State University students are dead, their families in mourning. Their classmates are shaken, bereft of the security campus should provide. The MSU community and the school's expansive network of alumni, boosters, and well-wishers is shaken to its core. The state waits anxiously for news of the 5 wounded hospitalized victims. Our emotions are still raw, we are still reeling. At this moment, it feels like something must change. But it felt like that just 15 months ago, after a malevolent teenager at Oxford High School killed 4 of his classmates, injuring 7 more. It felt this way after the Lunar New Year shootings in California, after Uvalde, after Pittsburgh, after Charlotte, after Las Vegas, Orlando, Sandy Hook, Littleton. We know this moment. We've been here before. What this time is different? 1 vote. Last fall, Michigan Democrats took the slenderest of majorities in each chamber of the state legislature. 1 vote in the House, 1 vote in the Senate, where Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist could break a tie. We want to believe that this will make the difference, but after decades of indifference, it feels naive to believe that anything can. For 40 years, Michigan Republicans controlled the state legislature. After the Oxford High School shooting, gun reform bills could not even get a hearing. Earlier this year, Republicans were peddling the canard that there is no common ground on gun reform, warning that overreach on such supposedly controversial legislation could doom Democrats in close districts in the 2024 elections. But gun reforms are not controversial. Our state is often divided. On guns, we are not. 90% of Michiganders polled last fall supported background checks, and 73% favor red flag laws that allow a judge to confiscate the firearms of a person who might harm another. Similar majorities support laws that require safe storage or trigger locks for weapons not in use. In an election year widely expected to favor Republicans, Michigan voters re-elected Democrats Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, and Attorney General Dana Nessel. Each has taken public positions on gun reform. And legislative Democrats owe that one-vote majority to Michiganders who want things to be different and trust the Democrats to get us there. This is a test for Democrats. After 40 years of relative powerlessness, the party has to govern. Last week, the Free Press's politics team surveyed lawmakers asking their position on gun reforms. The questions yielded uneven results. Some legislators, mostly Republicans, simply refused to participate. Others said they required more details before pledging support. Some Republican lawmakers are punting, as is their wont, to better mental health care or stiffer enforcement of existing gun laws, both issues their party declined to take up during their 4 decades of control. Let me add, it was the Republicans that shut down most of the state mental health hospitals under John Engler. That is truth. Most of the Democrats who responded support the reform bills. A worrying number of Republican lawmakers do not. If you're among the majority of Michiganders who support gun reform, call your elected officials in Lansing. House Speaker Joe Tate acknowledges the Democrats in closely drawn districts might pay a price at the ballot box for supporting such measures. But he poses a different question. What about Republicans in closely drawn districts who don't? Tate said, quote, "How do you tell a parent you voted no?" End of quote. On Thursday last week, Senate Democrats introduced 13 bills co-sponsored by the entire caucus with those reforms most Michiganders support. Tate and Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks expect the reform bills to pass. In the House, Tate says he anticipates bipartisan support. He said, quote, "We have seen these tragedies and they are going to continue if we do not intervene." End of quote. Brinks said the mood of this state has changed. Now, not supporting gun reform is a political liability. Some opponents of the measures will argue that these laws would not have changed the circumstances of this shooting. That doesn't matter. Not even more far-reaching gun reforms can completely end gun violence. But the reform bills are sound policy supported by most Michiganders. And if these laws would not have stopped this shooting, well, they might stop the next one. Wake up, lawmakers. Americans deserve better. This moment demands action. Michiganders deserve more. We've written words like these over and over. We've beseeched, implored, and ordered. We've made the case with polls and statistics, with the stories of those lost and those left behind to mourn. And nothing has changed. But this time there is one vote. One vote is a tenuous safety net. It is a slender shield between the bodies of our children and those who would do them harm. It may be enough. And so, amid despair, we find hope. What if it is different this time? And with those powerful words, that's going to wrap things up for this episode. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.